battles at Lexington and Concord. Now, just kind of a recap, Jada. Who's marching and how many are marching towards Lexington? 700 British soldiers are marching towards Lexington. And Brianna, why are they going to Lexington? What's the purpose of them going to Lexington? They're going to try to capture Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who are major contributors to the Massachusetts legislature, right? And Myra, why are they going on to Concord then?
All the supplies that they like stored, all the gunpowder and ammunition and all that.
Okay, they're going to get we like to sometimes call that an arsenal. They're going to go capture that arsenal that has been stockpiled of gunpowder, arms, and ammunition that the rebel militia has stored. That's the whole purpose behind it. So, on the morning of April 19th, 1775, on the morning of April 19th, when did they start the march, by the way? Cody, what date? We're talking about the morning of April 19th, 1775. When did they leave Boston?
April 18th.
The day before, April 18th. So the morning of April 19th, 1775, these 700 British troops have reached a field just outside of Lexington. Okay? The morning of April 19th, 1775, these 700 British troops that have been marching from Boston have reached a field outside of Lexington. Remember, Lexington comes before Concord. As those 700 British troops reach that field outside of Lexington, they meet head-to-head with 77 members of the Massachusetts militia. Okay? So as those 700 British troops reach a field just outside of Lexington, they are met by 77 members of the Massachusetts militia, led by John Parker. So as these 700 British troops reach a field outside of Lexington on the morning of April 19, 1775, they are met by 77 members of the Massachusetts militia under the command or direction of John Parker. What's the reason that the Massachusetts militia are gathered in the field, Connor? Why are they there?
Stop them from entering Lexington.
Stopping them from entering Lexington and then going to Concord. 77 versus 700. Okay? Now, John Parker knows his men are outnumbered like 10 to 1, right? Almost 10 to 1. But even though he knows he's outnumbered 10 to 1, he sends a message to the British troops. And this is what he says. He said, "We are here, we have guns, and we're going to resist." So even though John Parker realizes that he is outnumbered 10 to 1 by British soldiers, he sends this message to the British as they meet. He says, "We are here, we have guns, and we are going to resist." We are here, we have guns, and we are going to resist. Well, the British major that's in charge of those 700 troops, his name is John Pitcairn. John Pitcairn, on your ID sheet. And he really doesn't want to engage these pitiful 77 members of the Massachusetts militia, because he's got in mind that he's got to secure a bridge that's closer to Concord. He doesn't want to have to mess with these 77 militiamen. So British Major John Pitcairn does not want to fight the militia in Lexington. He's running behind, and his goal is to secure a bridge closer to Concord. So he just sees this as nonsense. Does that make sense? Here he is with 700 strong, being stopped by 77 members of the Massachusetts militia that are putting on this facade that they are ready to engage, even though they're outnumbered 10 to 1. And British Major John Pitcairn does not want to deal with that. But He's gonna have to, isn't he? Isn't he forced to respond? He's standing here, they're standing there, they're in the way. Well, he does respond to the militia and their blockade of Lexington and Concord, and here's how the events occur in order. These are the 6 events in order you need to make sure you know. What do you think the first thing Major Pitcairn does when he's approached by these 77 militia that tell him that they're there ready to fire if they need to?
Wow.
Well, he might have laughed, but we're talking about what would he order the colonial militia to do?
Stand down.
There you go, pretty close. So Major Pitcairn immediately orders the colonial militia to lay down their arms. Pitcairn immediately orders the colonial militia to lay down their arms. So that's the first thing that happens in order. Is Major Pitcairn immediately orders the colonial militia to lay down their arms. The second thing that happens is they respond, they being the Massachusetts militia, they respond by raising their weapons at the British. So after they're told to lay down their arms, they do the complete opposite and they raise their arms at the British. The Massachusetts militia responds by raising their weapons at the British. The third thing that happens, as the Massachusetts militia raises their weapons at the British, their leader, John Parker, orders them to hold their fire. But they're ready to, right? They raise the weapons, and they kind of, to be honest with you, they do that maybe a little bit in defensive response. When he tells them to lay down their arms, their automatic response is to do what? Raise their weapons. At that point, John Parker, who's commanding the militia, says, hold your fire, because he doesn't want any firing at this point. Well, when the Massachusetts militia respond by raising their weapons at the British, and John Parker orders them in to hold their fire, what do the British soldiers do? They raise their weapons, okay? They raise their weapons in defense. That's the fourth thing. The British soldiers then respond to the militia by raising their weapons. And what does Major Pitcairn do next? Tells them to hold their fire. So picture this in your mind. You've got both units pointing weapons at each other and both commanders telling their men to hold their fire. What?
Their names are both John.
Oh, okay. I thought maybe you were coming up with number 6. What happens next, Sydney? What happens next? The last thing that happens. Somebody shoots. To this day, they do not know from which side, but somebody disobeys their orders on either side and fires. Okay, so somebody disobeys their orders and fires. No one knows to this day for sure which side did that. Well, this disobeying of orders results in a barrage of fire from both sides. They start to fire at each other. And who's getting the short end of the stick here, Elizabeth? The colonists, the militia, are soon overwhelmed, and they retreat back into the woods to try to protect themselves from British fire, because they're outnumbered 10-1. So the Massachusetts militia are quickly overwhelmed, and they immediately retreat into the nearby woods for protection. So in less than 15 minutes, 8 Patriots lay dead, 10 more wounded, no British casualties. So in a matter of 15 minutes here, 8 Patriots lay dead, 10 more wounded, with no British casualties. Well, what do Major Pitcairn's men do after they overwhelmed the militia at Lexington? They head to Concord. And when they get to Concord, they do the following 3 things. So after routing the American militia, British troops then march on to Concord, and they do the following 3 things. First of all, they cut down the Liberty Pole in Concord that was erected earlier during the conflict between the two sides. Okay, they cut down the Liberty Pole that's in the middle of Concord, cut her down. What?
The British?
Yeah, British come into Concord, the first thing they do is they cut down the Liberty Pole, which is in the middle of town. Second thing they do is they go set fire to the courthouse. British soldiers go set fire to the courthouse in Concord. And what's the third thing they do?
Yeah.
No, what are they going there for?
Yeah.
They destroy the gun arsenal carriages, the gun arsenal, several of them that contain gunpowder rifles and ammunition that they had stockpiled. So they cut down the Liberty Pole, they set fire to the courthouse, and they destroy several of those arsenals that contain gunpowder rifles and ammunition that had been stockpiled by the colonists. Now, as they're doing all this, what are the colonists in Concord doing? Rallying. About 1,600 of them. And they're arming themselves, and all of a sudden, these 700 British soldiers look around and go, uh-oh. And they kind of get together, they converge together in the center of town, because what are they going to have to do, Talon? Fight their way out, because where are they going to head back to now that they've accomplished their goal? Where are they going back to? They came from Boston. Very good. So, by now the Redcoats are facing approximately 1,600 angry colonists who are waiting for them as they prepare for their return to Boston. And when they discover what's happening, they kind of withdraw to the center of Concord. And they're going to eventually abandon that formation and hastily retreat to Boston. Right? Okay? Well, basically, these colonists have gotten themselves behind stone walls and buildings and trees in Concord and along the retreat route back. And as these British are trying to get back to Boston, they're getting fired upon like crazy from these 1,600 angry colonists. So, after cutting down the Liberty Pole and setting fire to the courthouse and destroying those stockpiles of ammunition, rifles, and gunpowder, the angry colonists have rallied, about 1,600 strong. They're waiting for them as they prepare their return to Boston. When the British discover what is happening, they withdraw to the center of Concord, and then they have to abandon that formation and begin a hasty retreat towards Boston. And during that retreat to Boston, the 1,600 angry colonists and militia are firing upon the Redcoats from behind stone walls, building trees, etc. Now, here's where the story gets good. As they're retreating back towards Boston, those British troops pass Samuel Whitmore's farm. Remember Samuel Whitmore? Guy that had served for 50 years in the British Army, had grown a hate for the British because of their oppression of the colonists and their troops and this and that. And Whitmore is ready for them. And he turns his anger towards the retreating colonists. And I'm going to tell you in order what he did as these British Redcoats are retreating past his farmhouse. How old is this guy? 78. First of all, as the British soldiers approach him, he fires his musket and kills one Redcoat. So as they're retreating back by his farm, 78-year-old Samuel Whitmore fires his musket and kills a Redcoat. Then he pulls out his 2 dueling pistols and he fires twice, killing 2 more Redcoats. Remember, these aren't semi-automatic weapons. You fire them once and it takes some time to reload, right? So he pulls out his 2 dueling pistols and kills 2 more Redcoats. This is a true story. Next, he grabs his old French saber that he had captured in the French and Indian War, and he charges after more British soldiers with this saber. So he shoots one with his musket, pulls out his dueling pistols, shoots 2 more, pulls out his saber that he had won in the French and Indian War, and he goes after more Redcoats. And as he does that, he's shot at point-blank range and bayoneted more than a dozen times by retreating redcoats. He's shot at point blank range, and then as he's laying on the ground, he is bayoneted no less than a dozen times by British redcoats. You know what bayoneted means? They have a bayonet, or it looks like a knife, so to speak, on the end of their rifles, and they bayoneted him no less than a dozen times. And the British left the 78-year-old Whitmore for dead and continued their retreat back to Boston. That is the way to go. If he went.
What?
Oh.
He does not die of his wounds. He survives and lives until the age of 98. True story. So they leave him for dead. And Alex says, what a way to go. And it would be a good way to go out if he went out. But he didn't. He survives those bayonet wounds and that shot at point blank range and lives several more years and dies at the ripe old age of 98. True story. Not another kid in Wyoming knows that story, I will assure you. It is true story. Now, let's talk about casualties at the Battle of Concord. Who won this skirmish? I'll tell you the casualties. Now, what are casualties, first of all? We need to understand that. Killed or wounded. Okay, killed or wounded. Now, you can be killed, you can be mortally wounded, in which you die from those wounds, or you can be wounded, in which you survive. Okay, but casualties are a total of those. Okay, so 73 British soldiers were killed at the Battle of Concord. 73 British soldiers were killed at the Battle of Concord. 174 were wounded. 73 British soldiers killed, 174 wounded. How could you be another casualty other than wounded or killed?
Captured.
That would not be a casualty, that would simply be a capture. But what would be close to that?
Mortally wounded.
Missing. Missing, okay? And there were 26 British soldiers that were missing. So the casualties included 73 British soldiers killed, 174 British soldiers wounded, and 26 British soldiers missing. Americans killed or wounded, 49. Americans killed or wounded, 49. Why would they have so many less casualties? They were undercover and they ambushed him, yeah. 49 killed or wounded. Well, the redcoats, the ones that survive anyway, finally reached Boston late in the day of April 19th, 1775. You can picture this in your mind. They arrived with weary faces, bloody bandages, men in tattered uniforms carrying their wounded comrades. And when they get back to Boston, General Thomas Gage has received a pretty clear message from the colonists. They're much more determined and much more ready to resist than he had ever anticipated. Okay? So, as the British soldiers arrived back in Boston with weary faces, bloody bandages, and tattered uniforms carrying their wounded comrades, General Thomas Gage has received a clear message from the colonists. They're much more determined and much more effective fighters than the British general ever thought they would be. Now, this isn't the only fight that's going on. During the Battle of Lexington and then Concord, north of Massachusetts, a group of militia known as the Green Mountain Boys seized 3 British forts. This wasn't the only action going on April 18th and 19th of 1775. North of Massachusetts, a militia known as the Green Mountain Boys had seized 3 British forts. At this time in history, the Green Mountain Boys were led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. So again, as the fighting is taking place in Lexington and Concord, North of Massachusetts, the Green Mountain Boys, a small militia, had seized 3 British forts. The Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. And the 2 most important forts that they seized were Ticonderoga and Crown Point, both located on Lake Champlain, which we'll talk about later. So as the fighting in Lexington and Concord is continuing, the Green Mountain Boys, a small Massachusetts militia, led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, had seized 3 British forts. The 2 most important of those were Ticonderoga, Fort Ticonderoga, and Fort Crown Point. Both of those British forts were located on Lake Champlain. Now, why did they capture those forts? Carter, what was it? They want to capture British soldiers? Was that their goal?
That gives them more way in battle.
What would they gain by capturing those forts?
Weapons, ammunition.
Gunpowder,
supplies.
shot, rifles, cannons, all that stuff. The reason they took the forts was to rob the forts of their munitions, or ammunition, gunpowder, rifles, cannons, cannonballs, etc., etc., etc. So, let me ask you this question. Have shots been fired between American colonists and Great Britain? Have we ever had shots fired between the 2 sides before? We've had conflicts, throwing of ice, Boston Massacre, but have the American colonists ever fired back at British soldiers? No. Well, now they have. So shots have now been fired between American colonies and Great Britain, which tells you that the colonies in Great Britain are at war. Okay? All right. Very good. That'll take us to our next subtopic then, which is the second